Our first speaker is Alan Gale. Alan is the CEO of Aimee Health, that's A-I-M-E-E Health, a digital health platform advancing human longevity and combating chronic illness through artificial intelligence and systems science. Alan is an MIT-trained engineer, lifelong biohacker with a 20-plus year career in technology, and is a serial entrepreneur. He grew up in Marin County with a love of nature, math, and biology. He attended UC Berkeley as an undergraduate, where his interests expanded to the fields of cognitive psychology, neuroscience, nutrition, and ultimately electrical engineering in a way to better understand the brain as an electrical system. Alan later attended MIT, focusing on biomedical signal processing, culminating in a master's thesis using active noise cancellation to measure brain waves in response to stimulation by an artificial retina. This experience of applying tools from engineering to solve new problems in health ultimately drove Alan to create his latest company, Aimee Health. More information can be found at aimeehealth.ai. And with that, I'd like to invite Alan to come up and speak on his new paradigm for optimizing health and longevity with diet and targeted supplementation, a systems and nutrition approach. Welcome.
Can everybody hear me okay? Great. So let me just ask a quick question of everybody. How many people did something healthy today? Raise your hands. Wow, that's awesome. Anybody want to volunteer what they did? Worked out? Good for you. Anyone else?
I had lunch. It's fish and broccoli and steamed broccoli and carrot on the side.
Sounds delicious. It was a fish and broccoli dish, and it sounds like it was cooked in a very healthy way.
Yeah, but it's kind of hard. It's particularly well-known cafeterias that we use. But unfortunately, they don't cook not soft, and it's hard for my teeth. Why they don't cook so? What is your opinion? Is it they do it on special, kind of Mediterranean way? They don't really cook very well, don't steam long enough. Is it hard? It's hard to chew. Maybe it should be like this, I don't know, to keep more vitamins.
Yeah, if you cook less, it'll have more vitamins, but you got to be able to eat it, and it's got to taste good too. Well, the reason I ask is, many people are actually quite motivated. So tonight I'm going to talk about, what are people doing to be healthy? What are they getting right? What are they getting wrong? And I want to sort of paint a picture for how we've thought about health for a long time in society, going back even thousands of years, and how that's progressed over time into the system that we have now and sort of the direction that we're going in technology and in healthcare to help address people's problems. So tonight I'll talk about people's motivation, the problem itself, history of systems and science, what we're doing presently, how we think about systems on different levels and what does that mean for our health, and then what does our product Aimee provide as a tool set to help people become healthier and live longer. So as I mentioned, people try to be healthy. About half of us take a supplement every day. 73 million people are tracking their diet at least partially every month. And there's a ton of great science. 450,000 articles can be found in PubMed just on the topic of nutrition itself. Unfortunately, the reality is very different. We're actually not very healthy. This year alone, 450,000 people will die prematurely from chronic disease due to diet alone. 30 million people are diabetic, another 100 million are pre-diabetic. It's been estimated that about 90% of those people don't even realize they're pre-diabetic. 133 million people have 2 or more chronic diseases. So ultimately, we're eating the wrong foods, we're taking the wrong supplements because we're not acting on the science itself. So if we go back to the history of system science and health, we can sort of see these trends over time between two different but complementary views. Neither one is inherently good or bad. They're both important. They just give us a different perspective on our health and on what we do. The first view is looking at the parts of the system itself. This is more of a reductionist view. So what are the components? So for example, is it an orange or is it a collection of slices of oranges? Is it the pulp? Is it the vitamins? Breaking it down into its essential building blocks is the goal of the parts view or the reductionist view from science. It's been the dominant view in modern history because we frequently discover new tools, microscopes, other inventions that help us learn more about the world around us. It's also been very successful in helping explain behavior and predicting outcomes for specific conditions. The alternative to that is the systems view. And this is more of an integrative view. So it looks at how the parts work together to form networks. There's an old saying, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. The whole is equal to the sum of the parts plus how the parts go together. The systems view is how the parts go together. So it looks at things like what is the organization and what's the relationship between the parts? What are the emergent properties that are expressed by the parts working together? So cells come to form tissues. Tissues can produce chemicals like hormones, for example, that work in conjunction by the cells communicating and working in tandem together. Many diseases like type 2 diabetes and even heart disease can be better understood by looking at this more systemic view because there's many contributing factors to many of these chronic diseases. If we go back to the earliest forms of medicine like Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic, which I'll talk about in a moment, illness and disease were thought of as imbalances in the body and imbalances between our individual selves and our connection to nature itself. And health comes from balancing those internal organs with those external elements. So treatments like herbal remedies and foods were designed around restoring those balance. And again, looking at nature as an example and seeing us as individuals as just being another part of nature that we need to work with in a harmonious manner. And a similar is said about Ayurvedic medicine. Also an imbalance in the body or stress. Proper or improper digestion is the root cause of many conditions, according to Ayurvedic. And again, it looks at things like body and mind and spirit and the environment and how they need to be in concert with each other. Diets are according to a different characteristic, influence that a person might have, according to whether they're vata, pitta, or kapha. The diets share certain similarities, like incorporating certain components, certain dietary rules. And again, it emphasizes a connection to nature through minimally processed foods, use of whole foods, and then working in our own internal systems like our circadian rhythms to be in line with nature itself. As we go forward in time, a few thousand years, we get to Hippocrates. I'm sure everyone's heard the phrase, let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. Well, apparently Hippocrates did not actually say that, and this is a big controversy, but it's apparently something that Hippocrates would not have said as well. Hippocrates is considered the father of medicine. He established medicine as a distinct profession, and he also considered disease to be the product of environment and diet and living habits. Again, a connection to ourselves as part of nature itself. There were two primary schools under this Hippocratic system, Cnidian and Cohen school. The Cohen focus was on more of a general diagnosis and more of a general ongoing treatment, more prophylactically. Whereas the Cnidian focus was looking at specific diagnoses for specific diseases and very targeted treatments. At the time, the Cnidian focus didn't gain a lot of traction because people didn't know about anatomy. There were a lot of taboos about doing an autopsy on bodies, so we just didn't understand what was happening at a fundamental level. Food and medicine were both seen important, food, of course, being more for the Cohen focus and medicine being more important for the Cnidian focus. But Hippocrates himself felt that food becomes part of the body. There's an enduring benefit. It's used as raw ingredients to build ourselves as a body. Whereas medicine was seen more as something that changes the body, limited in its application, limited in its duration. As we go forward, Leonardo da Vinci developed new empirical approaches that combined math and nature and really looked at the science of organic form. So he was moving more towards a systemic view, again, thinking of the person and the body in terms of how they fit into nature. Unfortunately, his work was virtually unknown both during his lifetime, and his manuscripts were hidden for 200 years after his death, only to be revived and appreciated at a later time. We move on to famous scientists and philosophers like Galileo and Descartes and Newton. Galileo shifted things towards the more mechanistic view of the world. His success in describing how the planets revolve around the sun, for example, and being able to predict when things would occur, like a solar eclipse, drove this worldview of thinking mechanistically. The universe is a machine, the body is a machine. Descartes promoted the concept of the universe as a machine also governed by math. He used algebra to solve other problems, in geometry, which was later used to help predict blood circulation and understand that. Newton, with Newtonian mechanics, was a towering achievement in being able to predict outcomes from looking at events, and also supported that mechanistic view of the world. As we move on into the 18th and 19th century, people like Goethe explored the nature of organic form, reviving a lot of the lessons from Da Vinci. He looked at the morphology of form and the dynamic nature of how things evolve from a child to an adolescent to an adult, for example. This later turned into a whole area of philosophy called the Gestalt, where you look at individual or components that are, again, a holistic view of those individual contributions. This systems view persisted for a while in society until about the second half of the 19th century, when the microscope was invented, which opened up a whole new world of germ theory and understanding of cells. And it again led science and mankind towards thinking about what are the elements for what we see. How can we break this down into constituent parts? And what does that mean in terms of smaller and smaller elemental components? So again, an invention, in this case the microscope, shifted the paradigm back towards this mechanistic view. The difference was that this lacked a view of seeing how things went together. This is the same with Louis Pasteur. Extremely important in the world of medicine, and extremely effective in curing communicable diseases, for example, but it certainly wasn't directed towards things like learning how cells work together or how the components of the body work together in a more harmonious manner. As we move into the 20th century, a field arose called organismic biology, which is similar to Gestalt psychology, again, in opposition to the more mechanistic view. And it gave birth to some of the earliest forms of systems thinking in a more directed manner. And it basically posed that organisms are an integrated whole, which arise from the relationships and interaction between the constituent parts. So no longer could we simply understand an organism by understanding the parts. We had to know how the parts went together. This led to the whole field of ecology that blossomed in the 1920s, and the idea of looking at relationships between organisms and food chains and food webs that became very important to understand, again, how networks develop and how they interact with each other through the parts. In the 40s, we saw the rise of systems theory in a field called cybernetics, which was really the conglomerate of multidisciplinary disciplines from math and neuroscience and engineers. And it found a lot of success in solving problems during World War II. And it led to a more formalized mathematical representation for equations that could be used to address more of these nonlinear network phenomena like feedback loops and neural networks. And it led to the beginning part of a more complicated form of mathematics called nonlinear equations. Going into the 50s and 60s, systems theory continued to have a huge influence on engineering and management, but it was almost a void in biology. Another major advance in DNA and understanding the double helix nature moved us back again towards the mechanistic view of health. I included here, by the way, a picture of Rosalind Franklin, who was arguably one of the most important of the 4 people that have often been accredited with discovering the nature of DNA. A lot of controversy there. She was not awarded the Nobel Prize along with the other 3 recipients. Some argued that it's because she was a woman, because they could only award it to 3 people. She died soon afterwards as well. But she was, I bring her up here because she was one of those unsung heroes in the history of medicine and science that deserves more credit.
Thank you.
But again, through the invention and discovery of something of very strong importance scientifically, it sort of shifted the pendulum back to this mechanistic reductionist view, learning more about the underlying parts, in this case genes and DNA itself. So as we move into the 20th century further, in the 60s and 70s, some of these breakthroughs that started with the cybernetic movement moved into complexity theory and nonlinear dynamics. And this was really spurned by computers. So this was the first time in the history of man where an invention actually drove the pendulum back towards the system side instead of towards the mechanistic side. Because computers allowed us to solve these difficult nonlinear equations that describe the relationship between the individual components in a network or a system. So that was an extremely exciting breakthrough, and it led to this whole new field that still is with us this day. This culminated in the 80s and 90s into a resurgence into systems theory and biology. Systems biology itself is a very important field that looks at how these networks work together in a biological sense. Of course, in the 2000s, we saw the rise of social networks and understanding how influencers and power comes from those influencers. And power, in this sense, is less about dominating and more about connecting. So it was a different kind of sense of power that found a home within this world of systems science and understanding. I threw this up here just to sort of give you a flavor. Hopefully it's not too small to see, maybe it is. But it gives you kind of a flavor for how this era of system science and math was developed largely in the 20th century through these different efforts and these amazing researchers within the space. So now I'm going to shift a little bit to more modern system science. And how do we apply these principles to the human body and our health and longevity ultimately? And this is an important area because it provides an overarching framework in order to interpret health. It again emphasizes the interconnectedness of the components of the complex systems. And when we think about system science, we can think about the system itself and the signals that either go into the system or the signals that come out of the system. So of course, the input signals influence the system, and the output signals are measurements of the system's health. The systems themselves are characterized by what we call system functions. It ultimately relates how those inputs influence those outputs. So when we think of signals in engineering, we frequently think of them in terms of either how they occur in the time domain or an equivalent version in the frequency domain. And this is pervasive in all of our digital communication. This is how cellular signal processing works, how Wi-Fi works, how control systems in automobiles works. this math and these principles are pervasive in our society, and what is not available typically is how these can be applied to the problem of biology. So when we think of, for example, a signal in the time domain, we could think of, for example, a cosine wave. So if we perform what's called a Fourier transform, mathematical conversion, that same cosine wave in the time domain can be represented as a single frequency in the frequency domain. So they're equivalent ways of thinking about that exact same signal, and mathematically they can go back and forth. And in modern communication engineering, it turns out that thinking of things and operating with signals in the frequency domain becomes easier. We can perform algebraic manipulations on those signals in the frequency domain, which is much simpler to do than performing more complicated differential equation and calculus solutions in the time domain. So same thing with things like speech. So if I speak into a microphone in the time domain, that information over that period of time can be converted into a set of frequencies, each with different amplitudes, that will 100% contain all of the information in my speech pattern, which can then be decoded on the other side after it's transmitted. So in the same way, we can think of nutrients and biomarkers also has signals. So if we think about nutrients, we can consider them to be the core input signal to the body. And we can think of food as, and supplements, by the way, as those vehicles that we consume in the time domain that contain those nutrients. So for example, I ate an apple at lunch. That's a time domain representation of my food. Well, I can also convert that to an equivalent or an analogous way in the frequency domain by converting that apple into a set of underlying nutrients. So instead of individual frequencies that we saw in communication engineering, we can think of each nutrient, vitamin A, vitamin D, amino acids, fatty acids, etc., as being distinct frequencies that are associated with that time domain piece of food that we consumed. We can also do something similar with biomarkers. So we can think of a biomarker like a blood pressure test as something that happened at a particular date and a particular time. But I can also think of it as, one biomarker that occurs at a particular health frequency, so to speak, as an output waveform. And so with those input nutrients, when we start to think about the system itself and how do we relate ultimately those input nutrients to some output biomarkers, we can think of what are these complex system functions that I've been talking about. So there's really kind of two forms of those system functions in our body in the way that the medical and nutrition world has developed. The first is what I refer to as nutrition system functions. And these basically relate what nutrients you should consume in what quantities for a particular part of the body. So for example, how much vitamin A and vitamin D and calcium should I consume for bone health? That would be an example of a nutritional system function. And typically, like many things in the body, there's some sort of Goldilocks range where you want these things to be. Shouldn't be too low, shouldn't be too high. It needs to be somewhere in the middle so it's just right. Not everything has an upper limit, but many things do. And again, in biology, we want this kind of channel of operation, so to speak, where the signals should be for a healthy individual. And we can also think of body signals inside the body, which are the result of consuming that food. So body signals can include many, many different types. So they could be genetic tests, they could be proteins that are found in the blood, they could be other metabolic factors like my level of lipids in my blood. We could also consider the gut microbiome to be different characteristics of the body and different possible signals of the body. And so think of it sort of as like this big chemical soup, which again is the result of what we consumed, seen in light of those nutritional system functions. And in the same way, we can also think about medical system functions, but in this case, they're more based on the diagnostics. So they relate that soup of chemicals in the body to some set of biomarkers that are indicative of the body's health or the system's health. So for example, healthy bones can be measured by a bone density test with some range of values that are considered optimal or healthy for an individual. So, we start with the nutrients, it goes through the nutritional system functions, results in these chemicals in the body, they go through the medical diagnostics, and out pops an output biomarker. And the reason I'm drawing it up this way is because now when we start to think of the input signals and the output signals, we can start to optimize. Ultimately, what we want to understand is what's the right combination of those input signals to drive those output signals into the right place. And we can do that through food, supplementation, and of course, other methods like prescription medication. But that doesn't have to be the first way that we go about changing the body. So in the same way that we just looked at one set of system functions, nutritional and medical for bone health, we can do the same for other parts of the body. We can come up with them based on existing bodies of evidence and science from the nutritional and the medical side and apply those same principles to the digestive system, to the neurological system, to the cardiovascular system. Of course, there's interdependencies between these systems. So if my digestive system is impaired, it'll affect virtually every other part of my body as well. But for the sake of what I'm going through right now, we could think of them sort of as quasi-independent. But in each case, there's a set of nutritional guidelines, so what nutrients are important for my digestive system, and there's a set of medical diagnostics. How can my digestive system be measured through these output biomarkers? And using this framework, we can use a very important principle in engineering called feedback. And so the way we're essentially thinking of this problem is when we've consumed some set of nutrients and we get some set of output biomarkers, what we want to do is compare those biomarkers to where we think they should be. And the deviation between that, what they actually are and where they should be, we call an error signal. And what we do is we use that error signal as feedback, and we drive recommendations in terms of other foods or supplements, for example, that one can consume that will reduce that error signal so we can drive that biomarker to be where we want it to be. And that's sort of the magic, is how do you come up with the right recommendations? And there's many techniques in engineering that we use to help reduce that error signal and drive towards an improved outcome and optimize that system itself as a result. And among the many different benefits of feedback are, number one, we get an improved stability for the system itself. So here's an example of two systems, two orange balls. Of course, the system on the left, and this is actually the definition in engineering, a slight perturbation results in either something that goes back to normal or it results in a catastrophe. So if you were to shake this image here, the ball on the bottom of the trough would go back there. So that's a stable system. It gets perturbed, but it goes back to where it should be. If you shake the system that's sitting on the top of the mountain here on the right, the ball goes down on either side. That's an inherently unstable system. So by making sure that our important output parameters are within the right optimal ranges, the system, the body, becomes more stable. So you perturb the body, and because it's already at that optimal place, it moves around a little bit, but it doesn't go outside of where you want it to be. So the system itself becomes more stable as a result. We can also optimize the system by, again, changing those inputs, those nutrients, for example, in order to, again, drive that set of output biomarkers to where we want it to be. And we can start with food and then targeted supplement, and maybe then, if things still don't work, we resort to prescription medication and other methodologies. This methodology using feedback also provides the ability to customize solutions for individuals. And we all know that we are a little bit different. We process carbs and fats and proteins a little bit differently. So these generalized rules of how much of different nutrients we should be consuming are exactly that. They're generalized. They may not be 100% applicable for every single person. So if somebody is following the protocol and they're not getting the right output biomarkers as a result, then the protocol is wrong. The protocol needs to be changed. So the method of using feedback allows us to make those changes on the input, measure the outputs again, and drive towards the optimization that we seek out. Another important principle of systems science is thinking about systems on different levels. And in the body, we can think of this as what I refer to as the 7-layer model of the body. So if we start at the bottom level, we can think of molecular interactions. So chemical reactions with DNA, for example, or in our bloodstream between different molecules. The next hierarchy is the cellular system. So things like molecules crossing the membrane are important. The organelles within the cell, like the mitochondria, are important. We can also think about the tissues and the emergent behavior that comes when cells work together in concert and, again, produce hormones or other chemical compounds as a result of that communication. And, of course, tissues go to form organs, which is a core functional component within the body. Organs become organ systems. Organ systems together become the whole body. And above that, you could even think of the highest layer being sort of the psychological cognition effects that we all experience. So what happens on any one level, of course, was influenced by and in turn influences things below it and things above it. And in a similar way, things like you've heard of the butterfly effect. So if we focus on things at the molecular and the cellular level and fix them there, those fixes tend to propagate up the system all the way up to the highest levels. Here's an example, and I'm not going to go through all the details of this. I'm sure everybody in the room already understands this even better than I. This is metabolism. So, and I bring this up because this is an example of that systems view. So, for hundreds of years, we spent time trying to understand, the components of this. And this is just an example of how some of the different parts go together when we process fats and carbs and proteins, and what's the relationship between the two of them, or the three of them, rather. So next I'm going to go through some examples of how our dietary input, again from nutrients primarily, are affecting our systems at different levels. So I'll start at the bottom and I'll work my way up. So at the molecular level, to me, one of the most fascinating and one of the earliest areas of science that's ripe for dramatic development and breakthroughs is this notion of epigenetics and which genes are actually turned on in my cells based on certain conditions like nutrients that I consume or exercise. So for example, one of the core nutrients that's needed for gene expression is something called methylation and methyl groups, which come from vitamins like folate and choline and other B vitamins. It could be compromised with people with certain gene variants. So they might need a methylated form of those vitamins, for example, to address those problems. The output of that proper gene expression is turning healthy genes on and turning off unhealthy genes. And again, this is an incredibly exciting area of science, and we're just now understanding the effects of foods and nutrients on how it changes our actual gene expression. Another important consideration at the cellular level is membrane integrity. So things like omega-3 fatty acids that we consume from fish oil or marine algae, for example, are extremely important in neuronal signaling between cells and maintaining flexibility in the cellular membrane itself to make it easier to absorb nutrients from the bloodstream. Another important factor is the ratio of omega-6 fatty acids that we typically get from carbohydrates or other protein sources besides marine ones, and the ratio of those omega-6s, which tend to be inflammatory, to omega-3s, which tend to be anti-inflammatory. So these are both actual biomarkers that can be tested and understood, and it gives us an idea of, are we consuming enough omega-3 fish oil or maybe not, and what the implication is if we don't. Also at the cellular level, a very important structure are mitochondria. These are the power plants of all of our cells. We have hundreds, if not thousands of them in all of our cells, and they produce the primary gasoline called ATP, which runs all of our cellular processes. So one example of how our diet affects mitochondria is, what's our primary fuel source? Is it sugar or carbohydrates or fat? For example, a ketogenic diet, which is very low in carbohydrates, causes the mitochondria to use fat as a fuel. Turns out that fat is more efficient. It's almost like a jet fuel compared to using carbohydrate. You get about a third more ATP per molecule of fat that's used as fuel compared to sugar. As a result, the mitochondria, these little power plants, put off less pollution. They're more efficient. Pollution in this sense is referred to as reactive oxygen species. These are oxidative byproducts which are important for signaling, but in excess can do a lot of damage within the cell. They can cause mutations in nuclear DNA, in the DNA in the mitochondria themselves. They can disrupt other chemicals. So you want to preserve your mitochondria as much as possible. And as a result of eating the right kind of diet and not overfeeding your mitochondria, even if it's with carbohydrate but not consuming excessive amounts of carbohydrate, you get improved cellular function. You get lower risk of DNA mutation, which can cause cancer and other disorders. In fact, some people have theorized that many, many diseases, common chronic diseases, all have their origin in mitochondrial health, in mitochondrial mutations, ultimately coming from our diet. Also at the cellular system level are stem cells. Stem cells are sort of blank cells, undifferentiated cells, excuse me, that can become any cells in the body. They're used for regenerating organs all the time with us. Unfortunately, our stem cell activity slows down with age. The remaining stem cells often don't work as well as younger stem cells. Some therapies that we go through, like for cancer, for example, can destroy and damage stem cells. And we need to consider, what are the strategies we can incorporate from a dietary perspective and lifestyle perspective that improve the stem cells themselves, as well as the signaling that occurs throughout the body. So if I cut my arm, there's signaling that goes on from that site of the injury to my bone marrow and other places where the stem cells are stored, so they can come out and repair and become new cells to replace the ones that were damaged as a result. At the tissue level, an important factor is something called angiogenesis. So this is the building and pruning of cardiovascular veins, arteries, and capillaries. So this is a common practice throughout the body. Too much can be bad for diseases like cancer. So we all, unfortunately, have cancer. The older we get, the more we have. But for most people, there are tiny, minuscule pinpoint tumors that our immune system is readily able to prevent from growing and becoming a tumor or a problem. Angiogenesis is one of those methods that can feed a tumor, and so too much angiogenesis obviously can be very problematic for cancer. And in fact, there have been many successful therapies that try to, and successfully have reduced that blood flow to tumors through this pruning of angiogenesis. And in fact, there are certain foods that can promote angiogenesis and can tend to prevent angiogenesis from causing those issues. On the other hand, too little angiogenesis in some cases, can also be a problem. People might have circulation problems, neuropathies, tissue damage and wasting. So again, like most things in biology, there's sort of this Goldilocks area where you want most of these processes to operate. At the organ level, we can also think of immunity. Immune system is our critical first line of defense against cancer and every other disease. Highly, highly influenced by our gut. And again, an overactive immune system is bad. That can lead to autoimmune disorders. An underactive immune system can lead to disease proliferation. Interestingly, certain dietary regimens like fasting, for example, can be used to improve immunity in many, many other parts of the body through essentially killing off the weak cells. They call them senescent cells. So these are cells that are older, that are not working as optimally as you would hope. And by putting a stress onto those cells like fasting or reducing calorie intake, for example, or even things like cold water showers, those stresses can often kill off those older senescent cells, which is a good thing. And then when you go off of that stress, so you start eating again, for example, your stem cells can regenerate those lost cells into healthy, fresher versions of them. So it's a way to recycle your bad cells and replace them with good cells. So you have a question?
Yeah, so, does something like exercise as a stressor help kill off those cells as well?
Yes.
Is that part of that function?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And exercise, fasting, reducing calories, going into a sauna, going to a cold pool, these are all examples of a phenomenon in biology called hormesis. And the idea is you put a small amount of stress onto the body that's not too severe and for a finite, limited amount of time, and the body responds by not only addressing the stress itself, but by fixing other things throughout the body. So those are all great examples of where the right kind of stress at the right time can actually produce tremendous health benefits. The other issue with immunity, as many people are aware, is inflammation. So just like I mentioned, the benefits of low-level stress for a finite period of time, unfortunately, most people are subject to the opposite. Higher levels of stress, or even low levels of stress, but over a protracted period of time. So dietetically, things like consumption of gluten, for example, have been associated with leaky gut syndrome, whereby partially digested foods are entering into the bloodstream, heightens the immune system response, thinking they're foreign attackers, and it makes the body more susceptible to autoimmune disorders because your immune system is at this heightened level for a protracted period of time. Same thing with sugar. Sugar, high blood sugar levels leads to microabrasions throughout the cardiovascular system, which also produces an inflammatory response, which over time can be extremely detrimental to a person's health. Another organ level system, even though technically this is not an organ, but it sort of acts like an organ, is the microbiome. So we have roughly 40 trillion bacteria living in our intestines, in our nasal passages, on our skin, about the same number of cells as we have in our body. It's been argued that we're as much a colony of bacteria as we are cells, and that maybe they're the ones that are running the show and it's not so much ourselves. We know that there's this deep connection between the gut and the brain, and the bacteria are a big part of that. They influence our immune system, our angiogenesis system, our hormone production, neurotransmitter production. Serotonin and dopamine are produced largely by gut bacteria, even as much or more in some cases than neurotransmitters in the brain are produced. So from a practical perspective, we want to think about what are we putting into our body. So prebiotics, which is the foods that bacteria consume, like fiber, are very important. And we can also add more beneficial bacteria through probiotic supplements, for example. And we even have good output biomarker tests now, like a gut biome check, that'll look at the quantities and the types of different bacteria that we have in our gut. This is, again, sort of like epigenetics, at a very, very early stage scientifically, but it's extremely exciting and a very, very important mechanism to help modulate health throughout our body. Again, looking at this from a systems perspective. On a whole body system, I mentioned earlier caloric restriction. So this, essentially is affecting what are the macronutrients and quantities that I'm putting into my body. So what we found in hundreds of different studies, including ones with primates, with the exception of one study, which was a bit controversial, but nonetheless, it's been very, very consistent results that reducing caloric intake by 10 to 30% can increase our maximum lifespan, meaning the average lifespan of the longest living 10% of the population. That can be increased by a similar 10 to 30% in duration as a result of that lifestyle. So, we think about this on a daily basis. Say 20% of 24 hours, about 5 hours. So if I reduce my diet, by about 20% or about a quarter of my plate, and I can get an extra 4 or 5 hours lifespan each day as a result, that's a good trade-off. The important thing to consider, though, with caloric restriction is you don't want to undermine the need to improve your average lifespan. Average lifespan comes from obtaining all the micronutrients and all the core things that we need for our body to function in order to reduce risk of the major causes of death: heart disease, cancer, diabetes, neurodegenerative diseases. So in other words, you can't just eat less and have it all be ice cream and expect that you're going to live longer. So the trick is eat less, but make it a very nutrient-dense diet, mostly plant-based, all the micronutrients. Very, very important. My personal recommendation is start with a modest decrease, 5-10%. Track your diet for a few days, understand how many calories you're eating, back it off by about 10%, stay there for about a week, see how you feel, see if your exercise is still okay, and acclimate to it. And then if you feel good, maybe try another 5 or 10% the next week. See how that goes. And slowly but surely, you'll get down to where you are, and your body will go to different set points, and you'll feel if you've gone too far, you'll feel if you still have further to go. Intermittent fasting, another example of hormesis that we talked about. And so there's been a lot of study and a lot of evidence of very profound benefits from this practice. And it doesn't have to be painful. Personally, I've tried fasting for 24 hours and longer. I get headaches. I become not a nice person, let's just say that. But for me, limiting the hours that I consume food to only 8 hours a day works. I'm okay with that. I get a little hungry at night sometimes, but that's okay. And some of the benefits come from the fact that digestion itself is a very difficult, energy-consuming process on the body. So if we prolong the time duration when we eat each day, those resources have to go to digestion, and they can't be used for other parts of the body. Think of it like an energy management system. So it's better just to pick a window, say 8 hours. That's what works for me. I eat my first meal about 11 in the morning, and consume all your food during that time. So some of the benefits of this practice, include there's DNA changes within each cell that again are saying, well, it looks like I'm in starvation mode here, so I'm going to use this other mechanism called autophagy, which literally in Latin means eat itself. And it recycles byproducts within the cell. So just like you might have excessive trash in your city if your power plant's producing too much energy, so may you have excessive pollution and trash inside your cells because your mitochondria are getting overworked. So things like fasting cause these changes at the DNA level to cause the cell to start eating these byproducts. So you not only clean up the trash, but you're also recycling the trash. And you become more efficient, and that helps preserve your mitochondria as well. It also helps kill off the weakened senescent cells. They can't deal with the fasting as well. And again, when you resume your normal eating practice, those cells get rebuilt with healthy cells from brand new stem cells. Also produces more mitochondria, and we all want more mitochondria. More mitochondria means the existing mitochondria have to work less. One more thing about mitochondria. We're born with this big excess of mitochondria, and we might have horrible lifestyles, for a large part of our life, and we never see the effect of it. But the reality is our surplus of mitochondria are getting depleted more and more, and we don't even notice it until we get to that critical stage. And then there's a deep drop in our health because we've hit that threshold. We didn't even know we were depleting them at the time. So things like exercise and these different hormetic effects, also induce the production of more mitochondria. I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth here about a ketogenic diet, just because it's also, it's not new scientifically, but it's new in the sense that it's being utilized in other areas and explored in other areas biologically than it has in the past. We've known for a long time that it's extremely effective for things like epilepsy and for other brain disorders. But now there's a ton of evidence, some of it's described here, in terms of other brain benefits and weight loss, of course, and physical performance. And one of the most important things is improved insulin sensitivity. So overcoming, for what many people have are years of excessive blood glucose and developing pre-diabetics from overusing insulin and insulin's inability to be as effective in your cells as it was earlier because of that problem. Ketosis is a normal part of biological function. Ketones are the primary fuel sources for your brain, especially when you sleep. So your blood glucose gets depleted. Ketones are used as a byproduct of fat breakdown. And again, it's sort of like a jet fuel for your mitochondria. Here's an example of sort of how the ketogenic diet fits in comparison in terms of carb intake compared to some other diets. And that said, personally, I do a ketogenic diet, but I also marry that with other diets that incorporate all those core micronutrients from consuming a plant-based diet. Question?
Sorry, so on your chart, you don't actually say keto, but there's paleo there. So are you equating the two, or where's keto on that graph? I guess.
So that's the
missing.
the WFKD on the bottom.
WFKD on the bottom. Okay, got it.
Yeah,
All
it was a scientist that tried to get cute with a well-formulated ketogenic diet as opposed to a
Thanks
poorly
for helping me with my eyesight there. Okay, good.
So keto diets are tricky. So you want to stay under 50 grams of net carbs per day, which is total carbs minus fiber. Some people may need to be lower than that, as low as 30 possibly. I would encourage you to track your food, get a sense for how many carbs are in different foods, and some of it's very surprising. So a banana, for example, 25 grams of carbs. That's half of your daily allocation. So can't really do bananas on a ketogenic diet, or you have to do a small piece of it. Fruit tends to be one of the more difficult ones. So you want to pick fruits that are very high in fiber. So berries, for example, are good examples, but again, limited. And meters are widely available. There's the best meters are the ones where you actually do a blood test. They're almost painless, and it's worth it if you do it once a day or, until you get a sense for if you're in a keto state. There's urine meters with a pH strip, not as reliable. There's breath meters, not as reliable. And what you'll find is as you stay in a ketogenic state over a longer period of time, you'll start to adapt to it, which means that when you go out of it, it'll be easier to get back in. Question?
Are there times of day when you're more or less likely to be in ketosis?
Yes, definitely. So in the early morning when you first wake up, you're probably naturally at your highest ketogenic state. So one of the tricks in actual implementation I find with virtually any diet is substitutes. So for me, it used to be like coffee. I would have an iced mocha in the afternoon. Sugar, chocolate, not that healthy. But I still had the craving for the coffee. So I found bulletproof coffee, which has no carbs. It uses butter and coconut oil or MCT oil as a substitute. So I get that craving for a coffee, I still have my coffee, it just doesn't have carbs in it. So over time I found, nuts are a good choice. Instead of rice, do cauliflower rice, like incredibly healthy, like 10% of the calories comparatively. There's even tortillas that are super high fiber. They do have gluten in many cases, so you got to be careful about that. But the point is, there are very healthy, good foods that are plant-based that will satisfy the ketogenic diet. Okay, lastly, on the systems level, actually not quite lastly, but on the highest level, we can talk about psychological systems. So I bring this one up here because it's the main driver for behavior, and it's the notion of habits. So habits consist of three components. There's a trigger that starts the behavior. The triggers are typically a person. So I see my brother who lives in Texas, and I want to eat pizza. We ate pizza growing up. I can't help it. I just get a craving for pizza when I'm with my brother. The time of day. So maybe in the afternoon, I feel like a cookie or a coffee, whatever. Could be an emotional state. I'm stressed. I want to eat something. Could be a location. I drive by a particular restaurant. I get hunger pains. Or some repetitive behavior that I'm doing. And then there's the behavior itself. And might be a good behavior, might be a bad behavior. But it's in response to that trigger, whatever that trigger was. And then there's the reward that you get from the behavior. And it could be an endorphin rush in the brain that gives you pleasure when you eat something that tastes good. It could be also something pleasurable in the brain from an emotional connection that you have with somebody. And so what happens in the brain is when you repeat that trilogy, the trigger followed by the behavior and the reward, over time, you lose conscious connection to that trilogy. You start to automate the behavior. And physically, at a synaptic level, those circuits that connect those three systems get stronger and stronger and stronger. And they've actually done tests with primates, and they've shown that over time, as the habit forms, their mental recognition and brain patterns decrease. And they get the trigger, and they automatically go for that food, and they automatically get that reward. And so that's why habits are very hard to break. You stop, it's hard to avoid those triggers. They're just out there. Some people do. So you stop drinking and you never go to a bar again. Well, there's other triggers too. But it's hard to avoid the triggers. So what is typically more effective for people is to understand the trigger, understand the behavior and the reward that you got from that, and then when the trigger comes up again in the future, find a substitute behavior. And the substitute behavior should produce a similar kind of reward to the behavior you're trying to replace. And that way your body and mind continues to get that satisfaction. It still responds to that trigger. So it's a way to kind of shift yourself psychologically into an improved outcome. So for example, I had a friend of mine who used to eat a muffin every morning when she'd get to work. So she started gaining weight. So I want to do something about it. So the time of day was the trigger for her in the morning. The behavior was eating the muffin, and the reward was the pleasure that she got psychologically as a result of it. So she ended up changing that, and in the morning, instead of eating a muffin, she would eat some fruit and some nuts. So still responding to the trigger in the morning, also eating behavior, and it produces a similar reward in the brain, and she ended up not caring that it was fruit and nuts instead of a muffin. So a good substitute. So it's a good exercise to go through. I also find that keeping a journal is very, very effective for sort of hijacking and getting into your subconscious and forcing your better self to come to the surface and reevaluate some of these ingrained habits that we have. Another example of what happens at a psychological level as a result of our intake are things like neurotransmitter production. So they're highly dependent on B vitamins and amino acids in our diet. We might need a certain form, like a methylated form of certain B vitamins, because they're more absorbable for some people that might have a genetic mutation that prevents absorption. And as a result of not having that right balance of B vitamins and amino acids, for example, we might have an imbalance in our neurotransmitters as a result. And these can cause a range of disorders and things that we actually experience consciously, like mood changes or anxiety. It affects our memory and processing speed, our energy levels, and even our sleep levels. Okay, so lastly, I want to go into some of the tools that we provide through our company, Aimee Health. All the tools are free to use. The only thing that we charge for are supplements, which are totally optional. But I want to introduce them to you as sort of a core way to do a simple analysis of your diet, and you can see the effects on different parts of your body, different systems, and understand, out of all the systems in your body that work in this cohesive manner, like where are my weak links? Like what should I focus on? And then how do I make changes to improve those risk points? So we identify health risks across all 12 biosystems, cardiovascular, neurological. We compare your dietary intake across a spectrum of 132 different nutrients against science-based guidelines, all customizable. So if you're working with a nutritionist or there's something unique to you, you can change all the guidelines. We identify risks by comparing those two. How much did you consume versus how much should you have consumed? And we give you a score. So maybe you get a 60 out of 100 on digestive health and you get a 90 on heart health. So you know I should spend more time on digestive health. And again, thinking of the system and the interconnectedness, we can start to see where's the weak link throughout all the parts of my system and how do they work together cohesively. We then use feedback to evaluate if you're consuming the right amount. So we, again, compare your diet to what you should have, or we also look at biomarkers. A limited set right now, but people can use your own biomarkers as well that you obtain from your doctor or otherwise, and compare those output biomarkers or those nutritional inputs against where they should be. And then based on how far those deviate from where they should be, we come up with recommendations in terms of foods and supplements in order to reduce those risks. So we know that nutrition is complicated, and as I mentioned before, there's this Goldilocks problem. You want more than a certain minimum of most nutrients, but not too much of many nutrients. So tracking them, making sure you're in that range is important. And as they deviate too low, add something. Too high, stop eating something. I find with people, it's easier to get people to add something healthy than to get something taken away that's unhealthy. And naturally, when you just add something that's healthy, you tend to replace the unhealthy things anyway. So that's what I think people should focus on. And fundamentally, we ask a basic question, like, do you need supplements? What are you getting from your diet? The typical supplement user, and this was myself for 20 years, I thought more is better. It's an insurance policy, right? Do I know it's in my diet? No, I'm just going to ignore that. So even though there's upper limits on some things, like I'm just going to assume I'm not exceeding those. But unless I know it's in my diet, there's no way to find out. And the quality of the supplements is also largely unknown for most people. They're not regulated. There's lawsuits and horror stories about toxins and hormones and ingredients that are provided in insufficient quantities compared to what's on the label. And so people just don't know. And then, the way people validate is, their two best friends, hope and prayer. And sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. So instead, what we offer is a way to determine what you actually need, either by analyzing your diet to see how that compares to what those generalized inputs should be, or to do a biomarker test. And again, it doesn't have to be our biomarker test, it could be another biomarker test. And from that information, we can help a person identify the nutrients they need in their food. We, again, provide the supplements. They're physician grade. Happy to go into details later about that and what makes them as such. And then retest. So figure out where you are, start a dietary protocol, food and or supplements, and then retest 2 or 3 months later. Make sure that that protocol is working. Validate it with an actual bona fide biomarker test.
I plugged in
Hold on a sec.
I went to the Apple store, And I plugged in Aimee, and there are many different Aimees.
Yeah, my apologies about that. We were late in obtaining the name Aimee in and of itself, so you can find us under Aimee Health.
Aimee Health.
Yes.
Okay.
So a little bit about our brain biomarker test. It's a cost-effective test, about $100, and it looks at biomarkers at the bottom level, at the cellular level. Actually, it looks at the membranes of red blood cells, and it also looks at the highest level, psychologically, on a cognitive level. So in terms of the blood test, it looks at something called the omega-3 index, which is the percent of omega-3s in your blood cell membrane, which is indicative of how much is present in the rest of your cells in your body. You want that to be about 8% or higher. It looks at the ratio of inflammatory omega-6s to anti-inflammatory omega-3s. You want that to be no more than about a 2-to-1 ratio. 1-to-1 is even better. And that's a measure of inflammation and your susceptibility to it. And then it also looks at something called palmitic acid. You want that to be under 20%, and that's a measure of a toxin that can disrupt some of your cellular signaling, like leptin hormone signaling, telling your brain that you're full. So that's also important in order to understand. And then on the cognitive test, looking at, again, the highest level brain functions, takes about 15 minutes, and it goes through some quizzes, a maze, and it basically looks at focus and memory, multitasking, and processing speed. And based on that, very simple test, you can see, am I okay with these biomarkers? Or if not, what can I do about it? I took the test, and with all the things I've been doing for years, I thought I would come out aces. And I took it myself a month ago, and I was low in omega-3. I was high in omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. And I scored below where I thought I should be on short-term memory. So I personally have started an omega-3 regimen, consuming more than I was before. I'm going to retest another 1 to 2 months, make sure my numbers go up, and then I'll iterate on that and make sure that I'm driving those biomarkers to where they should be. So we like to think of Aimee as the nutritionist in your pocket. So the way it works is when you first download the mobile app, we ask you a few questions to help assess what category you are according to the dietary reference intakes from a nonprofit group called the Institute of Medicine. And that's a government-funded group of doctors and nutritionists who have evaluated hundreds, if not thousands, of nutritional studies to determine how much of different nutrients you should consume at a minimum and a maximum. So you probably heard of the RDAs, so the recommended daily allowance. So that's part of the dietary reference intakes. That basically establishes the minimum. And from that photograph of your food, we make it easy to identify what foods are in that photograph. And then we break that down in terms of 132 nutrients, again, compared against those science-based guidelines. And we give you your health risks across your whole body or for each part of your, each system in your body. And then recommendations. So what can I do with foods or supplements, again, supplements are optional, to reduce those risks? And then lastly, we provide the supplements. They come in a 30-day supply of individual day packs. Everything's pre-sorted, making it very, very easy to utilize. So our offering on a high scale is really science as a service. So we incorporate different dietary protocols. We have a protocol for each part of the body, for all 12 systems. We have protocols for different health goals you might have, like weight loss or physical performance, for example. And we have, as I mentioned, some biomarkers that can be used to evaluate a person's status, as well as validating that the supplements and dietary protocols are working. And then, of course, we provide the supplements themselves. And we're working with health practitioners, so if you have any that you're working with, you might feel free to introduce them to me. I can introduce Aimee to them, and maybe they want to use it in their practice with yourself or with other patients. So the systems view in the world, kind of going back to where we started, is really rising. There's two important converging trends right now that are sort of shifting the tide back to the systems view in mass. One is this notion of do-it-yourself health. So we have so much data available to us now about all parts of our body, and it's almost seamless, not quite, but it's almost seamless in terms of being available on our phone and through wearable devices, even through our electronic health records. But we need to make sense of it. And that's sort of the next stage. How do we make sense of all this data? And how do we think of it in light of all the input data? What are we eating? What supplements are we taking as well? The other important development is the rise of medical treatments using nutrition. I'll talk about a couple of those in a moment. But this notion of a killer pill that's going to fix Alzheimer's or heart disease or cancer is a fiction. These are systemic diseases that have lots of contributions. There's a role for prescription medication, and even with those diseases, some prescription medication may help for some of those contributors to those diseases, but it's unlikely they're going to address all of them. So we have to start thinking about these diseases and how to address them as a systemic disease, which can largely be addressed through food and targeted supplementation. So here's some examples of some of my favorite books that embody these principles. Eat to Beat Disease by William Lee just came out recently. He talks about different foods that innervate 5 different systems in your body that heal itself. Things like the immune system and stem cells and angiogenesis and the microbiome and the immune system itself. The longevity diet from a professor at USC who has his own form of intermittent fasting called the fasting mimicking diet. And he actually used to work in a caloric restriction lab at UCLA before he moved over to USC and started focusing more on intermittent fasting. So great book, very practical, a lot of incredible benefits from utilizing that. Cancer is a metabolic disease, written by Thomas Seyfried. So he talks about, he's a professor at BU, and he talks about, I'm sorry?
He has spoken here.
Oh, he has? Oh, he's a great guy. I met him at a conference years ago. So he explains how cancer can be thought of largely as a metabolic disease. And as a metabolic disease, the mutations that often are caused require that cancer cell to only use sugar as a fuel. So a ketogenic diet, which is very low in sugar and high in fat, can ultimately starve those cancer cells while still providing sufficient nutrients for healthy cells that can thrive. Fat Chance is a book all about the evils of sugar and how it can hijack our body and even our signaling system. That's from a professor at UCSF, Robert Lustig. Grain Brain, Dr. Perlmutter, infamous, well-established functional medicine doctor, talks about the effects of gluten on the brain, even on a low level, and even how that affects our gut and leaky gut syndrome that I talked about. Undo It is the latest book from Dean Ornish, one of my personal heroes growing up. I don't personally subscribe to everything he does. He's a low-fat, plant-based guy, which is fine and perfectly effective because even though the carbs might be higher, because it's plant-based, there's high fiber, so he's still regulating blood sugar in the way it should be, and you're still getting your micronutrients, so that's awesome. The place where I deviate from him personally is I like a keto diet. So a little bit more difficult to do that on keto. And then lastly, the end of Alzheimer's. So Dale Bredesen, professor from UCLA, one of the founding president of the Buck Institute in Marin, talks about what in the book were 36 different contributors to Alzheimer's disease, including things like toxins in our water and air, and insufficient quantities of certain nutrients, and diet-based ways to address some of those problems. Very, very useful and informative, even as a precursor to Alzheimer's for basic things that are common in people in their 40s and 50s, like mild cognitive impairment. So his protocol and methodologies address, even these earlier stages to improve memory and mental performance. So final thoughts. This is an actual Hippocrates quote. Natural forces are within us, which are the true healers of disease. So eat your vegetables. Your grandmother was right. And thank you for your time.
Okay, yeah, a couple of hands. Well, all right. Closest one here. So we'll come back.
You mentioned your short-term memory wasn't what you wanted it to be. What was the nutritional response to that?
Magnesium, among others, and vitamin D, actually. So, and that's an interesting one because, as I learned, not all magnesium is the same. And most magnesium has difficult time crossing the blood-brain barrier. So there's a particular form that I use called Magtine. It was actually developed in MIT, and it's got something like 8 times more absorbability in the brain than standardized magnesium.
So I can understand your frequency to time domain transition for something like speech, but you lost me when you did that with food, because aren't we learning more that, you know, an orange is much more than the breakdown of the vitamin C and the constituents, kind of the reductionist method that you mentioned. So I'm wondering if you can say any more about that.
Yeah, so it's an analogy. I find it a useful one when we think about how we compare the output signals to the input signals. And you're right, there's much more in an orange than vitamin C. And I included it there, you know, as a way to understand, for those things that we do understand are important, like vitamin C or other nutrients, you know, we can start to measure from our food how much of those things are present. And, you know, there are synergistic effects. Ultimately, you know, there's a combination of what we know that's going to drive those output and what we don't know. So, you know, personally, my suggestion is it's better off to get your vitamin C from an orange than from a vitamin C tablet. But that's not always possible. And, you know, in some cases, like for example, omega-3s, you know, just because of fish toxicity, you actually might be better using a very high quality tested omega-3 fish oil capsule than eating actual fish.
That's a good example.
So you've explained how using your Aimee Health app, we can have you test and give recommendations and how we can get our biomarkers to change. Have there been studies done to correlate the amount of time with biomarker change and any health measures, changes like blood pressure, blood sugar, your cognitive test results? Have they changed with objective testing?
Yeah, so our next speaker can speak much more intelligent than I can about different biomarkers. She's a medical doctor, I'm not. I can tell you with respect to our biomarker test, which looks largely at omega-3s, there's roughly, the test that we do works on the red blood cells. Red blood cells have a lifespan of about 90 to 120 days. So the recommendation is to retest 2 to 3 months after the initial test or after you've started the protocol to start to see the effects.
So have you taken a cognitive test on your short-term memory since following the different?
Not yet, not yet. So, but that will be part of the retest I do in another month or so.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm hoping it was just an anomaly, but we'll find out.
Can your slides be available to us?
Absolutely.
Great. Can you send them to us or?
Yeah, what's the best way to make them available?
Do we? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So you could put your email address on the sheet.
Yeah, and if you want to send me an
Yeah.
email at that address also, I
Yeah.
can send you the slides directly as well.
Okay. Another question right here.
You mentioned 10 to 30% less calories. Of 2,000 calories, or is that a better
So it's a
metric
great
for what
question,
should be done?
and the research is a bit vague about it. And so what I found from a practical perspective is when I started, I began by tracking how much am I actually consuming, you know, every day, and I averaged it out to kind of get a sense. And whatever that was, you kind of find your own set point. Typically, like people tend to eat the same things over time. And whatever that set point was, in my case it was about 1,800 calories at the time, that was where I started. And then I would reduce by about 5% initially, and I would go for about a week or so. I would monitor my workouts, you know, do I feel tired or is my performance degrading? I would acclimate for about a week or more, and then I would drop a little bit further. It was pretty close to about a 50 calorie or so drop, daily, and I would stay there for a week. And eventually, over time, I just acclimated to different spots. I found that very interesting too. Like with my own story, I found that there were different set points, for my weight. And they were typically about 10 pounds different. So I'd be at one weight, and I'd be there for like years. And then I would do some kind of little change, and I would drop like 10 pounds over time. And then it wouldn't matter like if I continued that change or not. I would sort of stay there for a while, and I change something else, and I go down to another set point. And they can be, it's sort of, if you think of it again, sort of like the machine. You've got different tolerances. The gears sort of work and adjust accordingly, and your body acclimates to whatever it is, and you change it up a little bit, kind of that hormesis idea, and then the body gets to adapt. And so I think it's, no matter what you do, I think it's good to shake it up once in a while, just to give your body that resiliency and ability to adapt to something different.
Yes, you have your basically the input signals and then the output that you're kind of creating a data set and then comparing through the feedback on these certain sets. How do you integrate concepts like exercise, like rewarding work, like rewarding personal relationships, and how do we sort of, I'm interested in your thoughts as how to factor those in with this more sort of scientific, more easily measurable information?
That's a great question, and they're absolutely unequivocally very, very important components. So sleep, stress reduction, and I would consider most of those inputs. Some of them are outputs and inputs, actually. Like if I have bad sleep, you could think of that as an output variable or biomarker, and that also drives poor health as an input variable. So presently, we're not incorporating those components. I agree 100% they're important. We will at some point also. The area of functional medicine, I think, is really incredibly valuable because it does look at these other factors as well. And again, our next speaker is a functional medicine specialist and a medical doctor can speak to that. I would say that when we incorporate them, we'll do so certainly with exercise through more automated means. People tend to wear wearables. It can be available on your phone. And that will drive different genetic changes and different changes within the body as well. With respect to sleep, same thing. We could use sleep monitors, for example. Again, this data is becoming widespread and widely available. So when we integrate with those things, we'll also be able to integrate a host of output biomarkers that we don't have access to right now. That you obtain through your doctor and through other methods, separate from anything you do with us.
All right. It looks like that's it. Or one more in the back here, and then I think other questions people could come up and ask
Sure,
you
absolutely.
individually during the break. So one more. Here we go.
Can you say something? Oh. Okay, so about Alzheimer's disease, is it related to nutrients or something else, some other factors like a lack of sleeping or whatever? Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so there's, again, 36, and there's actually into the 40s now, contributing factors. So certain nutrients that you get or don't get from your diet, contribute to it. So for example, if you have low omega-3 fatty acids, you can, cause brain issues and improper signaling. If you're missing other core nutrients like B vitamins, you're not producing enough neurotransmitters. That can affect brain function, which can then, put things out of balance also. Another important factor are toxins that come from our drinking water or from our foods and air. And so, even with the protocol that's discussed in the book, they go through a battery of tests, including looking at toxins in your bloodstream. And based on these results, you might take different supplements or different regimens, including exercise and improved sleep, to help remove those toxins or to address some of those issues.
All right, let's give one more One more hand. Thank you very much. This is a great talk.